Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast based on writers sitting around, drinking coffee or other beverages, and talking about writing, publishing, the whole creative process. We do not censor ourselves, but we don't swear a lot, so please consider us PG-13. Your host today is me, John Schmidt. We're talking with Joel Righetti of Speaking Stone Studios, author and producer and talent for Tales from the Dungeon. Also, our other host is Dave Welsh.
Hi there.
Joel, hello.
Hi. It's great to be here, guys.
So I have a number of questions for you. First of all, your main work is Tales from the Dungeon, which is a podcast.
Correct.
You said you've written a fairly large amount on it. How many episodes does it have for our listeners?
So it started originally as a patrons-only release, and so my patrons are almost a full season ahead, 12 or so episodes. I think last week I just released episode 82 for my patrons, though I have a public release that comes much slower onto most of the wide public, Apple, iTunes, Spotify, and such. And I think I just released episode 70 this week there. So, yeah, that's the grand sum of it. And they run about 20 minutes a piece, roughly.
So you write, produce, do all the sound on these podcasts.
Yeah, against better judgment, yes.
And people can get a taste from them, and then they can buy in slightly and get fresh from the process. Let's talk about the process a little bit.
Absolutely.
First question.
Yeah.
Have you always been a writer? Are you a writer now?
That's a great question, and it's a question I still ask myself. The term imposter syndrome comes to mind often. I actually had never considered writing whatsoever until this podcast kind of came to me. And the podcast was more of a reaction to wanting to get something going for the theory of getting into narration more than it was writing. But with copyright laws and whatnot, I didn't want to go back and narrate a bunch from the early 1900s. And so I kind of came up with this idea to write this short story format podcast, but had never really written short stories per se. So I kind of tasked myself with writing 3 separate stories just to see if I could, in fact, write stories to kind of keep a podcast going for a little period of time. And I did. And shockingly, more than anything, was when I started writing, I've really, since this podcast has started, fallen in love with that process. It was something I didn't know I wanted to do or like to do until I started doing it.
The standard, and Dave can correct me if I'm wrong, statement of writers drinking coffee is that if you have the desire, anyone can be a writer. You are a great data point because you didn't know you wanted to be a writer until you were a writer. And
right.
The sort of, it's debatable, but the podcast view, as I express it, is if you write, you are a writer. Uh-huh. We don't gatekeep on the levels, because another thing is you can measure by words, but if you measure by works published, you have 82 separate 20-minute performances in the public on this project alone.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, let me ask, has that helped you get into narration, or has it sidelined you totally?
It actually kind of has sidelined me, and the reason being I actually took a narration from an audiobook narrator, a professional audiobook narrator, kind of during this whole COVID process, and it let me know that what I'm doing is not quite audiobook narration. It's a little bit different, and it's its own thing. So my issue or what I'm currently dealing with or struggling with is as this podcast is going, that's kind of the focus, is the podcast, the writing and the narrating there. There are definitely overlapping skills to audiobook narration, but it is its own thing as well. And so currently my time and my energy and my focus is on the podcast. Will that maybe lead me to shift into narrating other people's works at some point? It's possible, but there's definitely still training to be done there, things to learn.
We've talked to other people who about narrating and about voice acting and stuff like that too. I mean, we touch on all kinds of things that are tangential to writing.
Yeah.
To the question of are you a writer? Can you call yourself a writer? A criterion that John didn't mention, but that comes up a lot is, do you get paid to write? Or, are you a professional writer?
Correct.
It goes along with, are you published? But you can be published without, getting paid a cent, especially on the web and so forth. So
yeah. Yeah,
I'm not asking you directly.
No. I
I'm
find that
just saying
interesting. I mean, so I have a Patreon page, which I have a not overwhelming amount of whatever. So I am getting a small income, very thankfully, from a close group of people, friends, and others that are giving me a very small stipend. It's not anything that I would make a living off of yet. And I guess somewhere in the back of my brain, that's the difference between a professional, and maybe it's the qualifier before it, right? Are you a professional writer? Are you an amateur writer? Are you an aspiring writer? I guess that's kind of the interesting thing in my own head. Like, I guess I still consider myself at best an amateur writer. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And another criterion is, we seem to, be focused on creative writing, fiction or stories or
absolutely
essays and stuff like that. By some criteria, I'm a very successful professional writer because I'm a technical writer. I write for a living.
Yeah.
But the stuff I do is not creative in any sense, really. I'm just documenting software, how it works and stuff. So, there's a whole big space here where you meet some criteria and not others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think technical writing, I've known several technical writers. I think that is, that is a very specific skill set that you are a professional writer. And it takes, I think, an amazing amount of skill to take something that is very technical and then try to translate it into something that's understood by a wider audience. So,
yeah. Well, go ahead.
So, exploring the range of what it is to be a writer, I think everyone here, except for you, agrees that you're a writer.
Well, thank you for that. I'm getting closer to some qualified version of writer. I feel like it's the longer it goes, I feel like I'm more comfortable using.
Yeah, let me tell you, in the range of writers we have, there's a complete range of opinion too. So
yeah.
And I can tell you, as somebody who has written for since childhood and done creative writing since childhood, and so forth, you're in for a treat. The imposter syndrome never goes away. So don't look for that to just evaporate one morning.
No, I wouldn't expect, and I think it is also my personality to be more self-doubting than
I think it's more prevalent than people admit. You have to
yeah.
So moving on from whether we're writers or not, I honestly think you're more of a writer than I am, and I'm part of the writing crew of this podcast. So
well, thank you very much.
You are a writer. You are the writing crew for your podcast.
Yeah.
You have a deadline. You have, because either you feed Patreon or it goes away.
Right.
You have a large and complicated world, which one can see by looking at your website. And for God's sake, some very nice character art. Is that your work too?
Yeah, it's one of those things where fantasy art's always fascinated me, and it's one of those things where I have some artistic skill, but if I were to just do raw drawings, it would come out very poorly. But over, again, COVID kind of giving me time to sit and think, there's a fantasy map making program called Incarnate, and I have in previous versions of my working life been a land surveyor and drafted maps. So when I got this Incarnate program, it was kind of second nature to me. It allowed me to draw a fantasy map of the place in which I'm currently telling stories.
Could you pronounce the name of the place?
Of the map? Oh, yeah, the Ba-Ra-Ta province.
Okay, I was trying to figure out how to pronounce all the apostrophes.
Yeah.
Ba-Ra-Ta. Because it could be Ba-Ra-Ta, it could be Barata.
Right, exactly. No, it is.
Lambada.
It's basically it's an old tongue from the land that I'm creating. And so it's kind of in a hyphenated where you would put words together, basically, and it actually translates into the good land. So
not land like some.
Yeah, no. crazy. Anyway, and then character portraits was things that I kind of was tootling around with and figured out a way to take kind of my medium tech skills and my medium art skills and put them together into portraits of characters. So
I found it a really nice visualization. So
Yeah.
going back to you're creating, obviously, you've created a map. That's interesting to know you had the previous experience. There's a lot of good programs to do that with.
Yeah.
Or you can just totally cheat and go to one of the, you can even pay someone to create a map for you, which was kind of.
Oh, and there's amazing artists out there. So if you don't have the time, but you do have the money, go find somebody on Twitter. They're unbelievable, or somewhere, anywhere. They're amazing.
Yeah, my favorite is the eel historian. I'll put a link to him just because every day he tweets a historical tweet about eels. So,
That's awesome.
it's kind of specialized. Speaking of specialized, here's my first specialized writing question, which I think we have determined will need explanation.
Okay.
Are you a plotter or are you a free-form thinker who lets the characters decide where they go? Are you a pantser? Do you know what those two mean?
I don't, but it sounds like just from the limited context, I might be more of a pantser. This podcast started as it was supposed to be short stories that had nothing to do with one another. I had written down a list of very abbreviated topics. A guy dies in dungeon, a young woman hiding in the alley, a thief goes to visit a wizard. And it was originally supposed to be like a separate comic strip, but the more I started thinking about it and asking questions about it, then I always say why, and I'm sure many writers do this, but why? And I wrote this first story, which at that point had nothing to do with it, but I started asking the why question. Why is this? Why is that? Why is that? And it has led to the fact that, in fact, this podcast has turned into a kind of an overarching plot that is twisting together, and it's all answering the question why. But it comes to kind of just wanting to know more about things I did, whether they have been on purpose or not.
Well, the why question method certainly seems like a quote unquote pantsing method. You're just kind of leading a chain of thought that's more or less spontaneous.
Right. And I think is a good point too. I've gotten to points in my story where I've sit down to write next episode and then been like, holy crap, I'm going to say, since we're keeping it mild, I need to figure out who some character who hasn't actually been mentioned in any of the stories, basically what they've been doing for a period of, their life or their years. So I definitely run into these roadblocks where I've, in a podcast format, I'm, going week to week to week. And so I've definitely hit points in the story where I'm like, oh no, there's this huge plot arc I need to figure out that probably will never be narrated, but I needed to understand how these parts tie together. But it definitely is kind of on the fly.
Yeah.
Did you take any writing courses to get you going, or what did you do did you just sit down and start writing? How did you get into the writing?
I did just sit down and start writing. All the way back in high school when we went to the final year, your kind of options for senior English, which high school English was never a fan of. We had basically AP English or normal person English, or they were going to offer a creative writing class.
Is that NP English? Normal person?
Yes, NP, AP,
math jokes.
P, I like it. Very good. But so I had signed up for the creative writing course, having no thought or desire that I would be heading into any sort of creative anything later in life, which was subsequently canceled. And then I wound up in a regular English class, which I hated, and kind of let my grades really slip. And so when the midterms came around, I wound up writing what turned out to be an essay to the teacher saying, I hate normal English. This is ridiculous. And I kind of laid out all these points. And so I got a note in some other class, please come see the English teacher. And I was like, oh, geez, I'm in trouble. And when I went in, she sat down and she was overjoyed because she was supposed to be teaching the creative writing class that was canceled, and, was impressed with the essay I had written explaining why I didn't like normal English. And so, for at least that small portion of my senior year, she let me do some creative writing projects in lieu of other things. But after that, I never thought about it again. I I have read a lot of fantasy. I've been, in and out of role-playing game kind of things at different points in my life. But yeah, no, writing, this podcast literally started with me sitting down and writing.
Well, writing is one of those skills where the preparation is to do more writing.
Right.
Everybody will tell you that, right?
Right.
I mean, my preparation for being a writer was, I paid attention in school.
Right.
But I think also what's not said a lot of times is that hones your writing skills, but you also have to do a lot of reading. You have to read, especially in whatever genre you want to write.
Sure. And I think I've always had, and I guess didn't really consider it as an overwhelming interest in just stories and storytelling in whatever format, like television, movies, written books, audiobooks, whatever. Like, I have always very much enjoyed different tellings of different stories, tragic stories I am drawn to. I feel like the remake of Battlestar Galactica was always something that, to me, that telling of a society at struggle and what is it to be, or, humans trying to survive. Like, so it doesn't matter the format. I think since I've started writing, I really have realized that I have always had this passion for just good storytelling in whatever format or another. So,
right.
That is an excellent point.
Yeah.
So, okay. Sorry, Dave, I cut you off. Please go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just going to say, so you consume stories as well as produce them. So,
and I think you have to, like, at least in my opinion, you have to, because otherwise what drives your writing, right? If I love this and hate that, if I'm not paying attention to that, I wouldn't know if I wrote the thing I hated, right? Or wanted to avoid some trope or anything, intentionally having female characters in a fantasy novel versus not, right? Like, it's just more some of those things you pay attention to, I guess, and try to.
Well, I mean, there's another whole rabbit hole we could go down here about naive art, right? So you can you can write, folk art or naive art in writing as well as in anything else where you really aren't educated in the thing. But education in a lot of genres, again, getting back to this, is just reading it or exposing yourself to it.
Absolutely.
So like, especially in, like you said, tropes. There are all these tropes. Sometimes you want to avoid them, sometimes you want to use them, but you don't know what they are until you see them 100 times in science fiction or mystery or whatever it is you're writing.
Well, a tweet that made me laugh. I can't remember, not too long ago, was something to the effect of, I'm really starting to think I'm going to write this epic fantasy about a farm boy that didn't think he was anything but turned out to be. And so it's one of those things where it's been done so many times that it's kind of this brilliant moment to just recognize.
Yeah.
And it's classic hero's journey as well.
Right. Absolutely.
A whole other debate. But and it can be done well. I'm not even saying don't do it. It's funny to me that it's so ingrained that it can be done over and over again. And I think part of reading and writing to some point sometimes is comfortability, right? There are books I've read over and over again. And I think as much as anything, it is that format or knowing that you already know what the end is can be comforting, and especially in times that we're in right now where God only knows where we're going, or gods, whatever your beliefs are. But like, it's just one of those things where that repetition is comfort. So somebody can retell that farmer story brilliantly and have us love it, I think.
Yeah.
So I got to ask, do you have that farmer story in your podcast yet?
Do I have the farmer story specifically? I'm trying to think of my characters. I've definitely written about what's finally turning into the main heroic party. They've all kind of come from different backgrounds. There is definitely a character that started on a farm. So I guess in its own way, she may represent that in its own way, but she's part of a group of people that have all started from, I think some were more likely to head into adventure and others were less likely.
Yeah, adventure is being uncomfortable far away from home, or
Right,
danger far away
absolutely.
from home. Since some people seek it out, and
Yeah.
the rest of us just have a tire blowout on I-70,
Right.
and then the flood hits.
We
Welcome
pull
to
over.
Colorado. We're
Yeah.
taking your boat away from you, which is another sub-story.
An
It's
adventure is
interest-
just a disaster that you can walk away from.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting to talk about tropes and forms and what's the term? Subsets of the genre.
Uh-huh.
Subgenres?
Subgenres, there it is, because David put together a spreadsheet and then I put together a query on the spreadsheet that auto-generated subgenres and then went and saw on Goodreads how many books were in that subgenre.
Huh.
And pretty much any subgenre, it's in our archives, we'll put a link in this podcast, but any subgenre you could pick. And we had a limited set of subgenres because it gets way too big, way too quickly,
Right.
would generate usually on the low order 100 books, and then you look at something like D&D adventure podcasts. On one hand, it's got to be kind of rare, but on the other hand, I know about 4 of them.
Well, and I think what's interesting is right now there's a huge movement towards what's called actual play. So the podcast is a group of people getting together, recording themselves playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it's immensely popular and made specifically popular by a group known as Critical Role, who's the kind of like the apex of all of that right now.
Yeah.
But
or the progenitors, depending on you look at it.
right, everyone can fight about.
So why is this? Why is this popular? I mean,
why is that popular? Is that
Yeah.
you're saying? Why is the actual play?
yeah. Why is that popular? I mean,
That's a great question. And what's interesting is
it's
a very
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all right.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think it's interesting because it's revitalizing role playing, and I think what's hard about it, or what can be, or what people view as divisive, which is kind of ridiculous to me, is that there's people that have like, well, I've been role playing since 1970, so these young whippersnappers doing it on the radio, they're doing it wrong, or they're doing it whatever, they're changing it, and it's like any other art form, right? Like the Critical Role specifically is a group of voice actors that got together, and I think what's fascinating about it to me is it changed role playing from kind of a tabletop game, which a lot of people play as, like, I have a character, they have numbers, we roll dice, you kill dragons or whatever you do, into really building the storytelling aspect of it. They have very specific characters with stories and plot that's uncovered. And so to me, what they have created Critical Role, and really what I think everyone else is trying to emulate, is the fact that this storytelling aspect, that having a background, this uncovering of things as you go, and it is just another storytelling. And I would say that for me, I have a huge amount of respect for them. I also think it was a thing that it was a group of friends got together and did, and I don't think they had any idea how big it would get. And now, as anything that gets too popular, you are subject to every criticism, like you should have thought that out, like it was going to be,
right,
this public product that belonged to everybody. But in the end, they try really, really hard, I think, to be honest about what they are. So,
well, so it sounds like, they are just a fairly talented bunch of improvisers. And what I was going to say before was, this just sounds to me like, with the improvisation and the improv game that they're playing, basically, is just within the framework of the role playing game.
Absolutely. And I would very much say that is what it is. It is improvisation.
And that sounds really tedious to me.
It is. And I specifically didn't because it was a thought briefly. I went, hey, these are popular. And then I went, but there's no way I have the time or energy to organize a group of 1, 2, 4, 8 people and edit and cut down all of this stuff. And so it's how I kind of narrowed in and zoomed in on what can I do. And so when I decided what I was going to do, this kind of idea, the short story idea, came to me because it allowed me to just narrate and do what I was going to do by myself. Exactly. Right.
So changing the focus slightly, this is what you've decided to do, and you've given it's clear to me from my process-oriented brain how you got here. Yeah. If I was to advise someone who wants to get into this, into writing, into your kind of writing, into the podcast writing, now that you've walked the path, how would you recommend they get started? What do they need to do? What was the most important step?
Well, I think, yeah, and I'm still barely figuring out how to podcast, if that makes sense. Like at this point, I have a process in place for making a show that comes out every week, but there's so much more.
What a coincidence. So do we.
Yeah, exactly. There's always so much more to learn about promotion, marketing, technical aspects, like everything. So I think it's not any different than any other business. I think a lot of times people will start, let's say, a pizza restaurant because they love pizza, but what you don't think about is, hiring employees, buying supplies, doing all of these other things. So I would say to anyone that's going to podcast, it requires a very wide breadth of skill set. And one of the things a podcast I've been listening to kind of brought up, how much can you think about up ahead of time? Do I really want to do the editing of my podcast, or is that something I could pass off to somebody else, or stuff like that? So I guess my advice is just, if you're going to do a podcast, it's so much more than whatever it is your passion is. It's so much more than just the discussion or just the writing or just the whatever it might be. It takes quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's true. And a lot of, there are so many web personalities and web influencers and the whole ecosystem of web money-making endeavors now. And and I think a lot of them, discovered this as well, that there's a business side to it that you have to attend to as well. I mean, there always has been in any creative endeavor.
Right.
A lot of times it's harder than a real job.
And maybe, it absolutely is. And I think maybe that's a point to be decided. If there is one point, you better know going in, is this something you want to make a business, or is it a hobby? Like, I think very much decide, are you doing this to make money, or are you doing it because there's very different skills you probably need to bring to the forefront if you're going one way versus another.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. I like the fact that you didn't plan to be a writer and became a writer, because that's unusual to talk to. No, in a podcast like this, you're kind of a unicorn or a black swan.
Yeah.
Although, inside joke, you don't live in Sinagua, I think.
Do not.
So anyway, that's refreshing, but you discovered you liked it as you started to do it.
Yeah. And
you've picked a form of narrative storytelling, which is a very specifically, you put together a narrative and then you tell the story, as opposed to, the other possible forms. And you've got a good view on this. Quick ask about basic writing tools. What do you use to write things down on? Do you use Scrivener? Do you just...
I have a Mac, so I just type on pages. And if you saw my grammar and spelling, you would all scream out loud. I think that's one of the great things about a narrative format actually is, and especially in kind of a short format thing, I read it once to kind of edit for any major faux pas or miss whatever. And then a lot of times I'll be reading in the booth and go, that sounds horrible, or that combination of words is terrible, and will kind of edit when I'm listening to my own self. And so I think what's interesting about the narration point is it actually allows me to hear it and to go, that's not good, and change it in the moment as well, which I think sometimes if you're writing and reading, you don't have that third aspect of hearing it out loud, which has been an interesting kind of discovery. Yeah. I think on my second episode I had, when they were fighting hobgoblins, and I wrote the story and then I started reading it, and then it was like, the hobgoblin, the hobgoblin, and I was like, holy crow, this is terrible.
Spam,
what I mean?
Hobgoblin and spam.
Yeah, exactly. So I had to come back and be like, okay, foe, enemy, like what? I get the synonyms out,
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I just use Pages, and I haven't moved into any stronger, better tools at this point.
But you've just given us a process step that you hadn't mentioned before.
Yeah.
That I'm going to highlight briefly here, which is really simply read it aloud for the editing. Editing. Yeah. Does anyone ever? Is editing a real thing? Yeah, I'm going to shut up now.
I think it should be. You should take that time away, right? You write it, then you take some period of time, whether that be a half hour or a day, and come back and read it. And I think a lot of times, I'll sometimes be writing and be like, this is terrible, and then come back and read it and be like, oh, that's really good. Or vice versa, where you come back and be like, oh, this is really moving. And then you come back and you're like, wow, this is way too much or way too convoluted
or what was I thinking? Was it
right?
I know I like a piece of writing when I come back to it and I reread it and I don't think, in the words of Ursula Vernon, this shames my ancestors. Which is, it could be good, could be bad, but it's not shaming my ancestors.
Right.
So I'm going to move on with our bad
Yeah,
selves.
right. Just let it be. And I think that's also an interesting point. Sometimes you just got to let it be, right? Like, it's the weird part about art is always there's what you think about it, and then there's what the rest of the world thinks about it, right? Which could be entirely different.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and in between there too, there's whatever you consider your audience to be, especially if you're
right.
I mean, I tend to write for, I do a lot of writing for gaming, for example. So I'll write for my gaming group, or,
right.
I'll write for a specific group of friends or something. And, then your context is limited, just kind of as if you're writing for yourself, although it's a little bigger than that.
You have a highly focused audience.
Yeah, but I think that's true to any extent. Your audience is never everybody in the world, or whatever.
Right.
It's never universal.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be nearly impossible to write something that's going to resonate perfectly with, whatever amount of billion people we're up to, 8. I can't remember 9.
Yeah.
Oh, the eternal dream, the worldwide perfect piece of writing. But that's not my eternal dream. We're kind of running out of time, I hate to say, and we haven't even discussed your actual stories. So I'm going to try to get you back on in a bit, and we'll discuss the stories. But I would like you to mention your website so people can find your stories easily. We'll put it in the notes, but I want to hear it. So
if you go to www.talesfromthedungeonpodcast.com, that has links to where you can listen, has links to my Patreon page. There's a little bit about me on one page. There's how you can support the show. And there is a page that has a map of where I'm telling a story and some character art and some other stuff. So
okay. www.talesfromthedungeonpodcast.com.
Yep.
So we're going to put that link to that story and some other interesting things we mentioned here on our website, which is www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. We've been talking with Joel Righetti, Speaking Stone Studio, author, narrator, publicist, and all those other things you didn't know you needed, of Tales of the Dungeon, a weekly podcast that you can listen to or subscribe to. We are on Facebook and Twitter. I'll bet you money he's on Facebook or Twitter. If someone sends you a question, will you answer it?
I absolutely love feedback about my stories. The only way you can ever see the other side of that mirror is have somebody talk back to you and say, hey, love what you're doing, hate what you're doing, and do it in a nice way. So if you love it, leave a review. If you hate it, tell me to my face, and I'll do what I can do to change it.
Excellent. We respond to tweets. We answer email. He responds to tweets. He answers email. If you send us a tweet about email for him, we'll work it out. We'll get it answered. You have been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee and talking about writing, not so much coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by our hosts. Our main web support magic is brought to you by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer, backup web spider, and host today is Dave Welsh. Our intro music is Pretty Maid Milking a Cow, and our exit music is Breakfast with a Morning Person, both by Michael Engberg. You can hear more from Michael Engberg on manyhatsmusic.com. Our podcast sponsors today are Sign of the Debauched Sloth, Red Coffee's the Best Coffee, and Joe's Picnicking Supplies. Get out of the house, go sit on the grass. And hey, thank you for listening.